Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism, with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Mark Libecki and Mark Melton, reviewing three pieces this week. But first, I should warn you that Mark Libecki is in the streets of Washington for the National March for Life, so his audibility and connection may be tentative. And in fact, we hear the sound of the marchers now. Hopefully, Mark can mute that while I talk. Thank you, Mark. We're going to take a look or discuss, at least briefly, three pieces from Providence this week. Two of them closely related, arguably three. One is by our contributor Lubomir Martin Ondrasek, hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly, originally from the old Czechoslovakia, who's written a piece, Freedom in America, in which he argues there is so much focus today on justice and peace, but not enough on freedom, which is equally as essential to America's character and relating directly to its role in the world. The other piece is by a student at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Flynn Evans, called "To Challenge China, America Must Believe in Itself Again," emphasizing the centrality of America's founding principles in our self-identity, and especially in our contest with China, a moral, spiritual, and political contest, not simply geopolitical, military, or economic. And finally, we'll discuss, at least briefly, or I will discuss a piece I wrote for World Magazine that will be linked to in Providence about the billionaire, part owner of the San Francisco basketball team, who disturbingly said that he was indifferent to the plight of the Uyghurs in China. Obviously, human rights concerns are a hindrance to his own extensive financial interests as they relate to China, and even more revealingly cited America's human rights failures as a reason for silence about human rights abuses around the world. But first, we'll go to Lubomir's piece on the importance of freedom in America's self-definition, along with justice and peace. I don't know if Mark Libecki is still with us. We may have lost him to the streets of Washington. Hopefully he will rejoin us, but we still have Mark Melton. So Mark Melton, any thoughts on Lubomir's piece?
Yeah, on Martin's piece, I thought it was interesting, and I think it would be good, if we can get Libecki back on. Hopefully, he can rejoin us at some point, because I think he was they studied together, possibly. I can't remember if they ever.
University of Chicago.
Yeah. So anyway, so Martin's piece, I liked it because, giving this lens, it gives this lens of looking at a country through, promoting freedom with justice, and what's the other one? Peace, that he mentions, the three legs, the three pillars. Yeah. And so, he talks about how, like, if you only emphasize two or one, then it's kind of like a wobbly table. You need to, whichever one is the weakest, you need to strengthen and focus on it. And so that's a vision that I hadn't really, perhaps I've, thought about, but not thought about explicitly in those terms. And especially when he mentions how in communist countries that he grew up in, the leaders talked a lot about justice and peace, but of course they did not emphasize the freedom aspect of it and kind of the problems that can cause. And he is worried about how the United States is on its current trajectory. And so yeah, I thought it was an interesting piece to add a different perspective, a different lens to look at this particular question.
Well, I also recall that the mainline churches and much of the religious left throughout the Cold War emphasized peace with justice to the exclusion of freedom. And that was one reason that IRD was founded, to stress the imperative of freedom political and especially religious freedom in our contest with the Soviet Union 30 and 40 years ago, and just as important today in our ongoing contest with China, with Russia, and many other rival authoritarian regimes. The other article is related by Flynn Evans, emphasizing that America in its contest with China must stress our self-identity as it relates to the Declaration of Independence and the centrality of human dignity, human rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're not simply two rival superpowers contending for an economic campaign against each other, but rather two very different understandings about central human goods. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's going to become very important for America if we're going to compete with China to be able to emphasize this, the idea of liberty and freedom as a core, uniting factor for Americans, and to contrast us with China. And I think it also can lead to opportunities to, like, say China was to liberalize, like for some reason the communist government was to be overthrown, and the people would be able to kind of assert some other type of government, then there might be better room for cooperation, but in the same way that we can work with Taiwan and other countries in the area. But one of the questions that I kind of thought about while reading this is there's another argument that says that we don't become united before we get into a confrontation. We tend to historically get united after the confrontation happens. And so you see this, during World War II, where Americans get united together around kind of this liberal creedalism, this idea of the American creed as the main idea that unites Americans, that really kind of comes forth during the Civil War, comes forth during World War II, World War I partially, and it also during the beginning decades of the Cold War. And also I know that after 9/11, Americans really got united around the flag, so to speak, because of the terrorist attacks. And so Americans tend to get united after there's a major crisis, a major attack. And the question is, do we have to have that happen before we get united? So in other words, over the next decade or so, we'll see, does America get united in confronting China before there's a major threat like on Taiwan, say? And we'll see. I do think that there is going to be a major challenge going forward, where there will be businesses and different people will prosper by ignoring the atrocities of China, and there's going to be a temptation to ignore that, to excuse it, and that would weaken our unity.
Closely related to that topic, my piece for World Magazine about the venture capitalist billionaire who on his own podcast dismissed concerns about what was happening to the Uyghur community in China, in effect bemoaning the new US law prohibiting the importation of products that are implicated in slave labor by the Uyghurs in China, and saying, in essence, there was no reason for him or to anyone to be concerned about human rights in China. Why would they be? What he didn't say explicitly was it was a potential obstacle to his own profits, although clearly that was a guiding motivation. But he went on to make a quote unquote moral case that America was essentially had no standing to criticize the human rights abuses of others, having its own human rights concerns at home, a disturbing comparison in that there is no equivalent of the extermination of the Uyghurs going on in the United States. And for all of its faults and failures, the United States is a democratic regime with the guarantee of certain human rights to all people, which China, Russia, and many others obviously do not offer. But as you say, this will become increasingly common for those who have profitable relationships with China to not only disdain human rights arguments, but to try to draw moral equivalencies between China and America to morally ennoble their own dubious standing. Not entirely new. There have always been moguls who have argued for ignoring human rights, whether in the Soviet Union or even the old Nazi Germany, with whom they had financial arrangements. So this is a constant challenge and a constant tension, but perhaps will be greater with China than ever before in the past because of China's growing economic influence and economic power. Any thoughts?
Yeah, last year I actually wrote a piece about how H&M was kind of caught in this divide over the idea of Xinjiang, cotton being used or forced labor being used to produce Xinjiang cotton, and how H&M was saying that they did not use it. I think they deleted that part or that sentence off of their website because there was a lot of boycotts and protests in China that was threatening their businesses there. And this also affected, I believe, Nike and some other businesses. And then there are other businesses that don't do as much commerce with the West or with the United States. And so they are more interested in, cultivating that Chinese market. And they were kind of promoting the idea that they were using Xinjiang cotton, which is Xinjiang's the region that the Uyghurs predominantly are. Though I believe the forced labor question is not just in Xinjiang, it's in other parts of China as well. And one article that caught my attention today that's also related to this is how China is pressuring Lithuania to what Lithuania did is not related to the Uyghurs. It's related to giving an embassy to Taiwan, I believe. It has to deal with the wording that they're giving for the office for Taiwan, that they're using the word Taiwan and not Taipei. And so China is very upset with this. And they are pressuring businesses, like if they do use Lithuania for like manufacturing products and then exporting them to China, then they can't have like the origin being from Lithuania. And so they're trying to pressure businesses to then pressure the Lithuanian government to change their policy on Taiwan. And now there's a lot of German car manufacturers and others who are starting to get Lithuania or trying to ask Lithuania to change its policy. And the EU is also getting involved or trying to get involved. But that's interesting because China doesn't want to deal with Lithuania through the EU. They want to deal with it one-on-one, because if you have that one-on-one relationship, then China can strong arm Lithuania better than it could strong arm the EU. But that being said, the officials from Lithuania are saying that the EU is still trying to force Lithuania to follow Beijing's policies. And so that's going to be another example of things we're going to be dealing with, not just businesses and billionaires, but also other countries. And how well would China be able to use that, the sharp edge of economic power to coerce other nations, especially if they can split them apart from alliances or relationships with larger partners. And so that's going to be, I think, a major challenge for the United States going forward. And I'm assuming I have time to add one little other bit to that. I'm talking about the second half of the comment of the moral whataboutism that I don't know how to pronounce or can't remember his name, but that the billionaire venture capitalist was saying. And that of course reminds me of biblically the idea of take the rod, when Jesus said, like, before you start trying to take the, speck of dust out of your brother's eye, take the rod out of your eye. And too many people focus in on that first half of the parable, but they forget the other half, which is that it says, like, first take the plank out of your eye so that you can better see the dust in your brother's eye. So you don't want your brother to keep having dust in his eye, because that is cruel and that is unkind. The kind thing is to focus, once you get the issue out of your eye, you still have to address his. And by you don't help him by saying he doesn't have dust in his eye. So that I think that is, more people need to understand the full the full parable, and only focusing on one part of it leads to a misunderstanding.
Well, again, as Flynn Evans emphasizes in his article, amid these constant temptations to succumb to economic interest, we will have to hold fast to our founding principles of human freedom and human dignity. But that is the perennial, even the eternal challenge that will never, never go away, at least in this age. Thank you, Mark Melton, for this Marxism conversation. I'm sorry, the third Mark could not be with us more directly, but presumably he's thinking about us as he marches down Constitution Avenue in the National March for Life, and will join us next week for the next episode of Marxism. So until then, bye-bye.